Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. A transcript of today's podcast is posted on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts.
Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series. My name is Suzanne Miller, and I'm a principal researcher in the SEI Software Solutions Division. Today, I'm joined by my friends and colleagues, Will Hayes and Pat Place, who work with me in the Continuous Deployment of Capability group in the SEI Software Solutions Division. We're here to talk about their recent efforts to reframe measurement in terms of user stories to improve their relevance and utility. Welcome, Will and Pat.
Thank you.
Hello.
So I know that both of you have done other podcasts with us, but as you know, we like to give our audience a little bit of background on our speakers. And so I'd like to start with each of you telling the audience that isn't familiar with you already to tell them a little bit about yourself and what brought you to the SEI and the work that you do here. So why don't we start with Pat on that?
Gosh. What brought me to the SEI was actually interest in what was called at the time formal methods, and that was almost 35 years ago. So I've been here a long time and have not stayed doing that all that time. But at the time, we were interested in things like formalism and how you could use that to describe software, and I had appropriate skills. I think what keeps me at the SEI is the constant ability to change directions, to look at new things, and so I won't give the sordid history of all the things I've done, but for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been really involved with the use of agile thinking in government programs, and that's what keeps me excited.
Okay. And Will, give us a little bit of yourself and why you're here.
So like Pat, I've been here a little over 3 decades. My initial assignment in the SEI was with a team called the Empirical Methods Project. I was studying to be a psychometrician, if you will, at the beginning of my career. That is the science of assigning numbers and symbols to traits that are pretty elusive and difficult to measure, kind of appropriate for the topic we're pursuing today. Had a long experience working with many different organizations around the world in the CMMI program. Now I'm principal engineer and I lead the Agile transformation team with my colleagues here. The goal of our team is really to transform what Agile means for the Department of Defense, more so than developing Agile for its own sake. We are interested in exploiting it for a very challenging set of situations where it's applied today.
And everybody be nice to Will because he's my boss.
Mine too.
So before we get into user stories per se, let's first discuss what's the current approach to capturing measures in the development and acquisition of software reliance systems and sort of so we can have a contrast when we talk about user stories. Will, do you want to start with that?
Sure. So often the practice of measurement is an outwardly focused activity. That is, I collect data for someone else's consumption. Often the boundaries that we consider come from a pick list, right? So there is a graph that has been used or an index that is popular or some base measure over which there is, a fervent debate happening somewhere in the corner of the internet about the veracity of those base measures. But often it's a set of things that are chosen among, as opposed to a construct that is designed to meet a specific need. There's a lot of great work under the rubric of goal question metric. Comes from Vic Basili at the University of Maryland. Really nice conversations that have been structured around, if I'm to collect some data, I should understand the purpose to which that data is being put, and that purpose should be in pursuit of goals of the team, the division, or the enterprise. And often the veracity of measures is judged by the logical trace. It's sometimes an academic exercise rather than a notion of understanding the utility of the results that we're measuring.
Pat, did you want to add any comments to that?
Yeah, just a little. I think a lot of the programs I've seen, we're collecting a whole bunch of metrics because those are the ones we've always collected. And we just keep collecting them, not with necessarily any sense of purpose. The other thing I've seen at times is where we collect metrics because we're trying to catch the contractor out. We're trying to somehow say, hey, you're cheating us in some way, which really bugs me from my agilistic thinking sense, where I want to be collaborative, not combative. Obviously we want to make sure that the government is getting value for money, but something that's very accusatory may not be of any help.
Yeah, just to build on that, there's almost a forensic accounting mindset sometimes when we talk about what measures should be gathered, as if somebody on the periphery could reconstruct all the complex things that happen in a large program and make some, proof of the perspective they walked into the conversation with. And that is troubling.
Well, so you're trying to do something different. You're trying to help us with understanding the purpose of measures as we use them and collect them. And you outlined in your recent blog post, one of the things that we brought in with Agile software development, which we've extended beyond software development as well, is this concept of user stories, which if you think about a requirement being a what, then a user story is not only defining the what, but it also defines the who needs this, and more importantly, why they want that function. So it starts to get at that goal, question, metric kind of paradigm inherently in the user story. But you've actually taken it beyond requirements for products into using user stories as a way of describing measurement. And so let's talk about what do user stories allow you to measure that sort of typical measurement requirements would not give you? And we'll start with Pat this time.
So I don't know that we are measuring anything different by using this format, because I'm still looking at a measure, but we are bringing in the who wants that measure and why they want that measure. And I think this is psychologically very important. There are a lot of times people feel that they're judged by the measurements they're given. Well, yeah, they are, but that they might be judged unfairly, or the data they provide is going to be used in a way that's unexpected. And so if I say I want a particular measure and I'm going to do this with it, and this is why I need that measure, it reduces some of that fear that you might otherwise see, other than just saying, here's the measure. And I can't say strongly enough, it gives the why of creating the measure, which in one of our discussions with one of our customers, they said, yeah, we forget that all the time. We forget why we're doing this stuff. And this just brings it front and center.
Okay. Will, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so when I first learned the notion of what a user story is, I was taught that it's the promise of a future conversation, that it forms a basis for speaking in greater detail with more nuance of what is the business problem being solved by the implementation we're going to choose, knowing ultimately that there's more than one way to approach any problem. And so the notion that we might choose something different than we've done before because we have a clearer understanding of the need to be met, that really appealed to me. That moves us away from the pick list mentality that's often associated with measurement programs.
Okay. And I am aligned with both of you on the importance of that why. And Will, I'm glad you brought up the idea that sometimes having the why actually changes the what and can make us think differently about, well, what is it? Is this the best way for us to get the why? It's our initial thinking about how to get to that, but it's not always the best thinking once we start having that conversation. So I appreciate that. So when you're thinking about this, can one of you give me an example of identifying a user story in a software system that would translate into a measurement? And so how you would, what would a user story for measurement look like? Will, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So as a program manager, I need to understand the time it takes to run through the regression test suite so that I may budget for the time horizons required to get to a final build and a delivery. And so there may be lots of things that contribute to budgeting. There may be lots of things that contribute to timelines. There may be lots of things that contribute to the duration of the test suite running and the number of test cases, the kind of technology available, the diversity of the product that's being analyzed through that lens. All of those things matter. And so there may be multiple metrics that bear on answering the need of that program manager. Fairly broad conversation gets opened up by just one statement.
So I can see where that's a very different way of talking about this instead of just show me your schedule graph that gives me the time. And I don't know what other things you're going, like, I don't know that you're using that for budgeting. But when you tell me that I have this concern about budgeting, then we can open up that conversation. And that's really what we're talking about. Pat, did you want to add anything, or did you want to give a different example?
Yeah, I was thanking you for asking me second. It gave me a chance to think. I was thinking something like, as a quality assurance engineer, I need to know the percentage of coverage for my test cases so that I can be assured that my test suite is in fact covering all of my code. Kind of a very low level metric there, but one that's crucially important to somebody who is a quality assurance engineer. And maybe I'm predicting your next questions, but this brings in the who,
right.
Which I think is the other side of it. Is not everybody needs every metric, but identifying who needs each metric is crucial.
So have you run into cases where when you have a broader audience, you name all of the, like, would you suggest naming all the roles as program managers and cost account managers? We need blah, blah, blah. Or do you tend to make the user stories singular in terms of the role?
Go ahead, Will.
The connection to who's going to consume the information is essential. And I think one of the sources of challenge that we experience today is the lack of perceived ownership, that this is a graph we send to somebody out there for purposes that we may not fully appreciate. And so I think it's really important to be clear about who owns it and therefore the kind of responsibility they take on. It's one of the things that I think Pat emphasized well in the blog post to talk about the level of trust and kind of erasing the fear factor when it's clear what consumption is going to come from or how the data we're producing is to be consumed and what perspective is taken. And so if that changes, there's a conversation we can have about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So if I gave my answer to that same question, it would be a little different. And that's because what I usually find is different roles have a different why for maybe the same data.
Okay.
So that a PM's interest in the data is often different than the QA engineer's interest in the data, even though it's the same data.
That's very interesting because that allows you to understand better are these. So I have a concept that I've used for decades called powerful measures. And powerful measures are ones that are essentially base measures that can be used in different ways for different purposes. And sometimes, and it can reduce the amount of data collection. That's why I call them powerful, is because I can get multiple uses out of something. When I recombine with other things, I get information that's useful to different roles, different stakeholders. And so I take your point that why is really the thing that distinguishes what's the power that these measures have when we are talking about, what the QA engineer needs versus the PM versus the cost account manager versus the team lead. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that viewpoint. So this is really pretty simple concept, which is nice. We don't always have simple concepts to offer to the world. Have you tested this in any organizational settings that you work in? And what kinds of feedback have you gotten when you have used this in customer settings?
The answer is very much so. And in fact, that what I quoted earlier of somebody saying, we all often forget the why, came precisely out of one of these engagements with a customer organization. They were really very thrilled with this notion because it also allowed them to curate the measures they're currently getting. I will tell you that in one particular organization, the contractor is providing a large number of measures. And we went through as many people as we could find in the program office, including one of the people who was supposed to be receiving a whole bunch of these measures. And his response was, I don't actually look at that data. It's not useful to me. So in this particular instance, it looks like we're asking the contractor to provide data that nobody on the program office side cares about. Well, there's a cost to doing that.
Right.
And by highlighting the fact that nobody's looking at it, perhaps we can say to the contractor, you don't need to provide us that anymore.
And so the really clever way that Pat managed one of those conversations was to take that dashboard or that graphic that was being used and imposing a user story on it. And in using the name of that role that was receiving it and the conjecture at that point about how it would be used, there was almost a suggestion to that person of what you might do with this that they recognized that isn't what I do. And so the conversation was a very different one than, can you interpret this graph? Or is there some adverse or positive inference that could be drawn from it someday if it showed some pattern? That kind of arbitrariness wasn't really part of the conversation. It was much more a purpose-driven conversation, which really was effective.
I can see where, the people who put measurement requirements on a contract, right, are often not the people who are going to end up using those measures for management and understanding the effectiveness of what's going on. And so having, if I were to ask people to write their requirements when they're putting them on an SOW in this way, that would probably provide a much richer conversation even at the beginning, so that you could say, well, we really don't, no, we're not going to do that. So we don't need this measure. We need these. And we don't have anybody, and it's like, oh, this, in the who's of all these user stories, the PCAM, the cost account manager is missing. So what does a cost account manager need? So I'm envisioning a lot of different ways that these conversations can help at different points in an acquisition. And now you're making me think of how I might use some of this with one of my customers. But in the course of doing this, we always like to give people cautionary notes as well. Are there drawbacks to doing this that you've encountered, and how did you overcome them?
So one of my recent presentations, I used the analogy of, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So in people's eagerness to apply what they see as a fairly logical approach, we find there are times when we kind of need to rein them back in and say, well, yes, there is an elaborate story there, but recognize that space that you're talking about is well addressed already. And so you really want to think about the economic consequence to adding yet another measure. And really, if it is true that anything that you care about may deserve more than one lens on it. But just because you can think of a lens doesn't mean it gives you the visibility you need. Due diligence has some balance points, I think.
Sure. Anything from you on that, Pat? What have you seen?
I haven't seen huge drawbacks yet. I think we're still early days in making this a widely used approach. I mean, I think the management of the metrics, how you decide to cycle new ones in and old ones out, is something that we have yet to fully address. I think the keeping the why with the what absolutely points you to, just as you said earlier, the data we're getting isn't helping us make the decision we need to make. So let's change the data we're getting. But I haven't seen any sort of huge difficulties. I suppose the one that surprised me was people said, "Oh, it's user stories, therefore we can put it on the backlog and it's done." It's because something on the backlog, when it comes off the backlog for the product, it's done. Whereas these are not done. These are just ways of expressing something that's an ongoing measure.
Right.
But people kind of had this interpretation, because we used the phrase user story, that it's a one and done. And
Gotcha.
the only one and doneness of it is putting in place the measure. That's a story that belongs on the backlog, but then the actual data has to be provided on a continual basis.
And used on a continual basis.
Yeah.
If I could amplify what Pat just said, if you think about the progression of a product from its initial concept development to the time when you might retire that system, the needs you have for insight about progress evolve. And if you are forced to choose just one set of perspectives and live with their imperfection throughout the timeline that you're responsible for, you're depriving yourself of the insight you need. So this ability to change your mind or to revise the perspective is really important. Just want to amplify.
No, that's a very fair point. I run into that where it's like, well, we're not doing these activities anymore. We're more focused on testing activities right now and integration activities. And yeah, we're still doing incremental development, but our focus is different. And so we need to make sure that we amend what we're measuring to really align with that. So you talked early in the podcast about GQM, goal question metric, and now we're talking about user stories. And there are certainly some similarities between the GQM approach and the user story approach. But what are some similarities and differences in your minds between those two, so that people that might be using GQM already might be able to make a decision as to whether or not they want to include user stories in their practice? You want to start, Will?
Sure. If you think about GQM, it's eminently logical, right? We have goals for our enterprise, for the work we're doing, and those goals beget questions, and those questions can be answered by data. That logic, cascading logic, like so many waterfalls, makes a lot of sense. One of the patterns that we see arising from that compelling logic, though, is that the veracity of the graph I'm drawing with Excel in terms of serving the role it's supposed to serve is judged by the logical linkage to the question, the logical link to the goal, as opposed to the informative value for the decision maker and the caliber of decision they need to make. And so the level of precision I need, the level of relevance to where I am in the enterprise and what outcome I'm trying to assure, that's a much more nuanced, a much more user-driven kind of perspective. And we find that the promise of a future story, the promise of a future conversation that is represented by user stories allows us to get to that nuanced, serving the user-centric purpose, and avoid some of the traps of, well, this is logical. It maps to the goals and the questions, and so you can't tell me I'm wrong. We're going to proceed with this. It is really meeting a need more than answering a particular question.
Okay. Pat, you had a very nice way of talking about this. What is your way of talking about the differences?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, GQM is absolutely wonderful. I like it because it's focused on goal. And I think our metrics as user stories are similarly focused on goals. Each Y is a goal. But for me, the biggest difference is that the GQM is very top-down, if you will. We start with the organizational business goals, and all of our metrics have to somehow be coerced into that. And I see this approach as being very egalitarian, that everyone can contribute a Y, because people down at the bottom of an organization have goals. They have things they have to do just as much as people at the top. And they don't feel that they have to coerce their specific goals into one of the large-scale organizational goals. So I like that. And probably someone in the metrics program will want to try and map individual goals that are user stories up to the large-scale ones. And they might even find from the egalitarian bottom-up approach that the organization is missing some top-level goals. I'm pretty sure that we'll have covered all of the top-level goals going down.
Yeah, true. Okay, so when you think about this simple concept, we like to talk to people about, how do you transition this? And so this is actually one of the things that I think many of our audience members would go, oh, I know measurement, I know user stories, I'm in, I'll read the blog post and off we go. But what are some other resources that we may offer to help them transition into thinking this way and to be more mindful of measurement and agile settings in general? Will, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, so we have the real pleasure of working with a community of practice that we've sustained for more than a decade now, an Agile collaboration group that meets monthly in a Zoom meeting, and we have like-minded people from a great diversity of organization types that share their experience, firsthand experience. Sometimes we have people doing a trial run of a conference presentation they're planning to give. A really nice insider group that can talk about such things, and we certainly would welcome more membership in that. There's also a community under practical software and systems measurement that's been doing work that touches on these areas for a very long time. They've published a continuous iterative development measurement framework some time back that provides some nice examples and a list of things to talk through. They're also presently focused on a digital engineering measurement framework, which is probably something that a large percentage of our audience for a podcast like this would find interesting. That's a topic where SEI is doing some research presently as well. How do we apply model-based systems engineering in the settings where we're working? We are going to have a lot to say about that.
So that takes me to my next question, which is what's next? So give us a little bit more about that. You just teased it, Will. So just give us a little bit more about where you think model-based engineering fits with Agile and Agile measurement. And Pat, I'll also ask you to say what's next for you, because not all of our interests are exactly the same.
So what does an iterative and incremental implementation of MBSE look like? Many people, when they understand the power of the digital models that they can create to represent the capability they are looking to deliver to the user, they have the whole model in mind. And often the practice of MBSE and modeling falls into the big modeling up front trap, as somebody said in a recent internet posting. And we trap ourselves into nothing is visible until everything is done in the model. So what does the first increment of a digital model for a large-scale software system look like? It's kind of the similar question that we got asked a decade and a half ago. What does 1 week worth of an aircraft carrier look like? How can we apply Agile to such a massive problem? Very interesting conversation. Look for more of that soon.
Okay. Pat, what are you thinking about? What are the things that we're going to bring you back to talk about?
Well, I mean, for a while now, I've been looking at how you do earned value in an agile setting, and I think there's a lot to be mined in that area, and there's a lot to be said. And then I've got a sort of a little idea going on about are we asking the right questions when we talk about MVPs, but it's still a bit half-baked. So
we'll give you some time.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this week.
Yeah, it won't be this week.
Okay, I want to thank both of you for having this conversation with me today. It's always fun to talk about these things, and I hope that our audience has also enjoyed this as much as I have. We will be including, as people know, the links and the transcripts to any of the resources that we've mentioned during the podcast, including the blog post that relates to this topic as well, for those that want to read the blog post. I want to make a reminder to our audience that our podcasts are available lots of places: SoundCloud, Stitcher, Apple, Google, and my favorite, of course, SEI's YouTube channel. And so I want to thank you all for joining us today. And I want to thank Will and Pat again for having this great conversation.
Thanks for joining us. This episode is available where you download podcasts, including SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. It is also available on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts and the SEI's YouTube channel. This copyrighted work is made available through the Software Engineering Institute, a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. For more information about the SEI and this work, please visit www.sei.cmu.edu. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at info@sei.cmu.edu. Thank you.